Welcome to this webinar on AI risk as part of your overall business risk analysis. My name is Randall Laudermilk. I'm the Vice President of Product and Partner Strategy. So today we want to talk about the proliferation of AI in today's world and why we should care in terms of our overall risk management, specifically in AI tools, models, data sets, and the like, and how we perform our analysis and including AI risks within that overall analysis program. And lastly, we'll sum up with some best practices and sources to help include AI risk in your overall risk program. At the end of 2024, global AI investment was estimated to be pretty close to $300 billion with an annual growth rate around 36%. I did see a statistic a couple of weeks ago that said that number is already $350 billion in spend as of the end of Q3 this year. So those estimates of $250 million is probably well underestimated. 5-year forecast is close to $2 trillion to give you the scale in terms of technology spend, artificial intelligence, machine learning, large language models, and those type of technologies. Specifically in the retail market, projected to be about close to $200 billion by 2030, and again, around a 30-35% clip in terms of annual growth rate. Financial services following similar trends, around 30% growth rate. So you can see the things that we share in common when it comes to retail, finance, and those sectors. Significant amount of money spent in artificial intelligence and the different technologies around that, whether defensive or in terms of productivity, and growth rates 30-35% following the same trends. So as we perform our risk analysis, we always look at different phases and activities and following frameworks. And in this case, discussing the risk management framework from NIST. And we're trying to understand the assessment part, the assess part of an overall process that starts with preparing and categorizing and implementation of these type of frameworks, and then what you do post-assessment in terms of authorization, monitoring, and just rinse and repeat. So specifically for risk analysis, it's understanding the likelihood or impact of risks that could impact organizations, projects, and safety goals. I like this definition because it includes not only what we would traditionally think is business goals or organization goals, mission objectives, but also specific to activities, projects, and even personal safety and safety of the organization's resources. So within an overall risk program, the first thing you typically do, as we do in many projects or practices, is scoping and looking at the activity in terms of, is it an annual, quarterly, ongoing, continuous monitoring, those type of things. So one of the things that becomes very clear when we look at AI risks is shareholder involvement. Too many times as technicians or in charge of IT resources or system ownership, we get very myopic in our perspective and our specific swim lanes. But with AI, because of the adoption across so many dynamics and so many functional areas within an organization, stakeholder involvement for a risk analysis has expanded greatly. And we think about identifying AI technologies and usage, not only the tools that we would think that are more common, like data interaction, ChatGPT, Google Analytics, things like that, but think about code generation tools, embedded software, something that wasn't AI enabled a year ago suddenly is. And that includes the agents that we build and use, the different models, AI bots, and the data sets, whether it's training data or the source data or the byproducts that are produced as a result of using AI, enabling AI. So we also think about scoping in terms of third-party systems, our supply chain. Not only are we implementing artificial intelligence and machine learning and large language models, so are our competitors, but so are our third-party vendors in terms of our supply chain. So we also think about scoping not only in the transactional basis, but behavioral analysis. Think about unauthorized access, deepfakes, and other AI-generated personas, even company personas, as well as user ID theft in terms of facial recognition or voice recognition, and how that can be used in terms of interaction within your system, how these systems behave. Also, unusual spikes in size and frequency of activity. Think about an example of processing credit cards or system to system financial connections. When there's that $1 transaction that goes over to connect one system to the next and validate that connectivity, and then a second transaction to pull that $1 back. Imagine what can happen in an AI-based attack that has millions of transactions, millions of attacks, and takes that dollar in, never takes the dollar out. So we end up with millions of dollars in potentially lost money, as well as potential denial of service if it's fraudulent transactions. So we have to think about scoping a little bit differently than we have in the past. Also, external executive orders and laws, whether they're U.S. commerce laws, executive level laws, interagency laws, interstate laws, federal laws, even country laws like the GDPR that they have in Europe. Depending on your organization and how you move within your supply chain and your customer base, any number of these laws could be enacted or expanded on at a moment's notice. So it's good to keep track of those in terms of scoping for your risk. Industry compliance. Again, compliance standards are changing dynamically and very frequently now that they're starting to get a better handle on AI risks and what that means in terms of current security controls or even new controls to be put in place. So how can I be impacted by AI risks within a business operation? Fair question. If you're going to spend time and money, it's good to know where you're spending your money at. So AI-driven cyber attacks, we think about phishing emails, texts, fake websites, fake personal personas, automated malware, and AI bots used for more advanced types of attacks. Are we prepared for those types of things when they're coming at you faster and more complex? Do the tools that you use for defensive posture, do they size up when it comes to these type of attacks? Data handling, data poisoning, maybe a new term for some. Poorly trained AI agents, models, and bots. Recent example, ChatGPT, there was an AI bot that could promote opportunities for injecting transactions to manipulate behaviors or access critical systems, and even exploiting vulnerabilities to get access to critical systems and bypass or even kill security controls that you already put in place. So bypassing and misclassification or bias and misclassification, fraud detection systems incorrectly flagging transactions, whether that be a false positive or a false negative. AI-fueled ransomware. A new sort of concept for many is ransomware as a service. Bad actors are getting together, creating entire service platforms around AI-based ransomware. Layered attacks to bypass security controls, such as CAPTCHA, multi-factor authentication, even VPNs. And so the whole goal is to expand the adoption of these type of attacks and make it harder for us to build defenses and protect against the volume and complexity of these things. Another is exploitation of unpatched AI vulnerabilities. As we'll see later, we think about, can you fix what you don't have visibility to? And in many cases, in a recent study, they said 68% of organizations let employees develop or deploy AI agents without any high-level approval. So if you don't know how people are using AI and what they're using or what they're creating or how they're deploying it across your business or organizational environment, how do you know what you're not vulnerable to? And how do you know how to patch, reconfigure, segment off those type of risk exposures? Says only 60% of organizations even issue AI guidance. So with those kind of statistics, when you're thinking more than half of organizations are still trying to get a handle on the use of AI and how to set boundaries and policies and procedures and rules of behavior, is very concerning. So a couple of examples. First and foremost, some recent studies showed that 1 in 4 systems have already experienced some AI-generated attack in the past year. So this is not something that's coming into the future. The use of AI by us as well as our adversaries are already creating an environment for people to generate real, tangible attacks. And most AI-driven attacks, it's very similar to what we've seen with traditional IT or even traditional human weaknesses. Threats mimic human activity. AI now outranks vulnerability management, data loss prevention, and third-party risks on many CISOs' priority lists. 2 years ago, I would have never thought that statement would have been possible. But the risks are coming so prevalent now that now we're starting to get a handle on and understand the severity of these things and what we need to do to recover. So just by way of examples, we think about new ways to look at risk when it comes to how AI designed attacks are used or created, deepfakes and ID theft. And we think about social networks and we see videos or pictures of people and say, no, that's AI generated or that video couldn't be true. Well, just think about how an adversary can use that to create an entire company, or the employees of that company are not even real companies or real people, they're AI generated. There was an example of a Chinese tax system where an organization was created by AI, was able to get a tax ID and get access to the tax system. And then by using other layered attacks, malware, I think there was a camera attack involved, and they were able to use layered attacks to get inside of that tax system and steal over $77 million, as well as customer data. An offshore team, there was an example not too long ago where an offshore team was able to get employment by a US company, and they were using a real person that was extremely experienced, well adapted to the type of jobs that they wanted to get access to. And that person, of course, would get the interview, pass the interview, but the actual employees were AI generated. They were able to get tax IDs, do monthly reports showing how well that employee was doing, and collecting money at an hourly rate for that offshore service. And they weren't even real people or real work being accomplished. OpenAI's ChatGPT, very recently, there was a news article about a chatbot exploitation. The chatbot itself could be exploited to steal personal information from users' memories and chat histories without their knowledge. We look at Copilot from Microsoft. Copilot Studio uses a customer-supported agent. Researchers discovered that over 3,000 of these agents in the wild could leak internal tools and sensitive data. Very similar with Google Gemini and again with Copilot, susceptible to insider threats through social engineering and stealing sensitive communication. So these are tools that most of us are familiar with and maybe possibly use, as well as some others. Tangible, real-world examples where they've either susceptible to breaches and exploitation, or in the case of this CISO report, already being used for AI-generated attacks. So as we go through a risk assessment, we think about scoping, we think of the timing of it, and shareholder input and all of that. But having these examples and knowing what's ahead of us in terms of tangible threats, tangible risks, creates a little reality for us all, if you will. So we think about a target-rich environment for these attackers. There was a study from Synapsid that said when they did some vulnerability research, 10 out of 10 tested large language models already exhibited vulnerabilities. They compared the security posture across these models and observed that no model was completely immune from some type of vulnerability. Now, this image on the right is just an illustration of some work that we've done internally ourselves, list of vulnerabilities, and these are publicly known vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database. And you look at those, what they call CVSS risk rating or severity rating, and you think about critical level severities, and none of these are low. And using a scoring system, an algorithm that produces a score from 0 to 10, and look at some of these numbers in terms of severity levels, anywhere from 5 to 9.8. So these are medium to high to critical level severities just in the vulnerabilities without any kind of business context. So CISA is an organization that part of their charter is to create a repository of telling you when there's known exploits in the wild. And one of these, the Langflow vulnerability, is already showing that that some organization has used that for a specific attack. Most of these, at least in this list, don't show any active threat intelligence. But we look at the number on the right, it's the exploit prediction system's 0 to 1 score in terms of a probability that an exploit could be developed in the future. An exploit or a threat attack could be created in the future from these. And look at some of those percentages. I mean, 92, 93%, 78%. These probabilities for about a third of these are very likely that they're not only systems that are vulnerable to some type of exploitation, there's a real possibility that somebody's going to create an exploit for those in the future and find some way to exploit those for access to your systems. So when we talk about risk, too many times the word vulnerability and threat and risk get thrown around. Just for context, risk really can't be observed or measured without a number of factors. First of all, business context or impact. Then you look at where you're exposed. There's vulnerabilities, there's misconfigurations, there's a attack surface, if you will. Threat intelligence and likelihood is where that threat intel comes in. It's the same thing if I own a cabin in the middle of nowhere, what is my risk posture if I leave a wallet on the desk? Probably not much if I'm 20 miles from the nearest paved road, but if I did the same thing in lower Manhattan, that threat intelligence or that likelihood says you're very probable, very likely for that vulnerability to be exploited if the door's open. So that's kind of the context of risk. You have to have all these things in place. Unfortunately, as technicians, we tend to lean on the right side of the slide deck. We know about vulnerabilities and risk exposures and misconfigurations, and we tend to manage them by their type or class or severity and look at quantitative or qualitative measures around those vulnerabilities. And we think about threat intelligence. Yes, is it likely that something can be exploited? If I have a misconfiguration, how easy is it for somebody to work around that lack of a security control? Leading indicators and lagging indicators, you can think about if somebody tells me that there is a vulnerability, well, that's sort of a lagging indicator. But if you tell me that there's a potential for attack in the future, if someone can write an exploit for it, well, that could be a leading indicator that says, even though I don't really have a risk level at this point, I will in the future. So now I can lean into the future and determine what actions I need to take before that happens. So, but on the left side of the slide, we see things like business measures, stakeholder preferences, key performance indicators, asset classification, its business context, its attack surface. So those are the things that we need to develop in order to have to know impact to business context in order to be able to truly measure risk. So we think about context. If you ask a risk officer or other people involved in an organization, and they can talk about financial risk, environmental risk, geopolitical, competitor, customer confidence, compliance, those type of things are common in their nomenclature. But when you ask them about cyber risk, too many times it feels like a black hole because we tend to talk in technical speak. And the purpose of this slide is just think about our risk analysis, our risk assessments, and bringing it up out of the data center and being able to present it in a way that's meaningful to the leadership and the stakeholders, which are usually the system owners. So by way of illustration, we're doing a risk analysis, bringing all the pieces together. We think about there's different perspectives: business context, compliance, the technical measures, the vulnerabilities or other types of risk exposures, threat intelligence, and ultimately some way to correlate that together and measure some level or classification of risk. So as an example, asset number one is a critical asset tied to an e-commerce site. It's for compliance sake, because it's an e-commerce site, payment card industry standard has to be met. And in this case, there's a vulnerability that was found to be critical, level of severity of a 9.8 out of a scale of 0 to 10 as far as a numeric measurement. And this is a Langflow vulnerability. It's an AI technology. And if you look at those pieces together, critical asset, fails compliance, bad level severity. And if we look at threat intelligence, everything's lighting up. Yes, there's known exploits. There's evidence that has been exploited in the wild, and the forecast isn't going to get any better for the future. So if we took all of that, all of those dials light up and ultimately create a risk posture for us as a critical level of risk, at least according to this model. So if we look at asset 2 and 3, and this is where stakeholder contribution involvement is really critical when you're actually doing your assessment. Once you bring the stakeholders and the business impact in, we look at this second example, asset number 2 is still a critical asset tied to the shipping process and has a high level of vulnerability. It's 7.5 out of 0 to 10. Again, Bento ML is machine learning technology. And we look at the threat intelligence, there's active threat information about a known exploit. No active exploitation, but the forecast doesn't look well. 80% probability that there could be exploitation in the future. So ultimately, we would, according to this model, see a high level of potential risk to the organization, short term, and even more critical long term. But you'll notice between asset 2 and 3, two key distinctions. Both critical assets, both have fairly high levels of vulnerability severity, but one passes compliance and the other one doesn't. And one has threat information and the other one doesn't. So when you bring this information to the table in terms of prioritization, two things become very clear. The reason asset number 2 doesn't it passes compliance is because PCI doesn't care about denial of service. That DDoS is denial of service. So because denial of service by itself doesn't expose credit card data, cardholder data environment information, then it would pass compliance. But if I'm a stakeholder, a system owner of that shipping process, would I care about denial of service? Absolutely. Would I be concerned that there's active exploitation or a known exploit for that vulnerability? Absolutely. If I'm asset number 3 and I'm involved in inventory management, says, well, but it fails compliance. And it has, again, a fairly high severe vulnerability, but no active threat intelligence. So those are the key differences. One fails, one passes, one has an exploit, one doesn't. So now you have to make decisions amongst the stakeholders. Where do you start from? If you can only do one at a time, do you do asset 1, 2, then 3, or asset 1, then 3, and then 2? So that's where stakeholder involvement and criticality of the systems and business context matters. So we've said all that in terms of where AI risk can expose us to potential issues and how we might address performing a risk analysis and identifying what potential risk AI can present and where we are in terms of our potential risk posture and our risk position. But what can we do about that in terms of mitigation response as part of that assessment, prioritization, and finally, ultimately, resolution to move to the next monitoring phase of the framework? First of all, training and testing. We talk about skills, knowledge gaps, those type of things. Well, training can educate people on what they need to be aware of in terms of visibility or awareness of these AI type of attacks, especially when it comes to social engineering, such as phishing. But testing, you could use phishing, again, to test what they've learned and validate that people continue to do their due diligence to look for these type of vulnerabilities, these type of exploits, these type of phishing exercises, and be able to visually understand what they're seeing and when not to click on the wrong button. Asset management, we talked about including all the tools, the agents, the models, the data. And it also includes best practices in terms of what data are you using when you create training data. Making sure that you're not using sensitive data when you're creating these the training data, or ultimately what these models produce in terms of outcome. Policies, procedures, rules of behavior. When we talk about 60-some% of organizations don't really even have a current stated policy on how to handle the adoption of AI, the implementation of AI, the use of AI, and what information is generated and how that's shared. So all that has to be done. And again, across stakeholders. Vulnerability scanning, patching, configuration management includes AI tech, APIs, network and traffic anomalies, encryption keys, access control lists, use of multi-factor authentication. While some cases there are tools that could try to go after those controls and try to kill them, it's a layered approach. And so traditional vulnerability scanning, even traditional vulnerability scanning technologies are getting smarter and being able to provide support for looking at vulnerabilities in AI and patching, certainly prioritization, automated patching, scheduled patching, prioritization of what's the most critical assets and the most critical things to patch all play into the best practices. A lot of things we do now, this is just taking it to the next level and enhancing those to be able to respond to these new types of attacks. Remediation scripts. Many vendors, if there's not a patch available, will offer some type of remediation script that says it can't be officially patched. However, there's some mitigation or remediation that can happen that either isolates, creates some kind of boundary, some kind of control around that vulnerability, or some otherwise creates a virtual patch, if you will, to minimize the risk exposure. Threat intelligence on AI products. A lot of threat intel is starting to adapt more and more and more intelligence on threats coming in because of AI technologies and bad actors' use of AI to create new types of attacks. Logging, auditing, analysis, all of those things we're supposed to be doing. However, with these types of attacks, you run into scenarios where the types of information coming in, the scripts, the type of bits and bytes, if you will, it's more complex to find some of these types of attacks, and new modern technologies that do log analysis and gain visibility into those new types of attacks are absolutely key. So we really can't rest on something we might have used 3 to 5 years ago. We need to talk to the vendors now about what they offer in terms of new types of capability. They're able to go through those logs and look at that large volumes of data more quickly, more efficiently, and more effectively to give us visibility in what we need to do, either make changes or to stop attacks that might currently be underway. Pen testing and red teaming. Pen test teams using AI type of attacks in a white hat, of course, but using new types of technologies, including AI, to do their job in a more in-depth way to respond to the new types of attacks that they have to be measuring or investigating in terms of your defenses. Testing out of range as much as what passes. Too many times we tend to look at an assessment or we test a control. We say, yes, it passes the control, and it's a checkbox. However, there's not enough time spent on what about the anomalies? What's out of range? We talked about the example of when two financial systems connect and they have that $1 transaction. It's not enough to check, did it do the $1 and was able to successfully post, but did they take the dollar out? But what if I put $2 in, or $100, or $1,000, or $5,000? Or what's out of range in terms of frequency? Is it normal to accept 10,000 of these transactions a minute? So those types of out of bounds, out of range processes are really important when it comes to best practices. Data loss prevention, but also data leak protection. It's a little bit different way to look at this. But you think about using AI in training models, but we also talk about what information it produces, what it correlates, and that new information. Supposedly, with generative AI, your goal is to allow that to work autonomously to create new information, new results, things you couldn't do without it. That's the concept. But how are these data protected? How is it shared? How is it exposed? And can it be leaked, if you will, through other types of exploitation or attacks or misuse of the models that you create? Zero trust. Trust but verify has always sort of been the mantra. In this case, I would say zero trust means do not trust. Verify, then provide limited trust with a lot of controls and certainly session timeouts and things like that. So if anything does get through, there's limited exposure and you're managing sessions with very specific limited access controls and availability. Third-party vendor risk management, probably more important than ever. It's always been a potential risk when you don't own the systems that connect to your systems or you connect to. However, when you're thinking about AI, you can manage what you're doing, but what are they AI enabling? How are they connecting and what new technologies are they using to connect to the systems and the processes that interconnect? Change management, extremely important when you think about AI adoption. What you might have been using 3 months ago may not be using AI, but it is now. And so what type of risk exposure does that now present to you just through simply updating an existing piece of software? DevSecOps. It's been around for several years, the whole concept. We should have been doing security by design from day one, many, many, many years ago. However, more critical now when we start thinking about bringing in tools to do code generation, using AI to write entire applications, entire web front ends. But there's evidence out there that they may not be using secure coding practices. So what vulnerabilities or exposures is that code creating for you? So you still need to be having security by design. And it's okay to use these type of tools, but having testing tools in place to not just, again, did it pass some technical spec, but is it using secure programming practices and not exposing you to new risks? Cyber insurance. We all talk about having cyber insurance in case of some kind of unforeseen liability. However, cyber insurance companies, the brokers, the whole environment, the whole life cycle of cyber insurance, the whole program, they're getting smarter on this as well. And they're building in protections into their policies. So if you're not doing these type of things, the policies, the procedures, the rules of behavior, the technical infrastructure around it, how you're protecting data and critical systems, customers, supply chains, you may find that you've got a policy that isn't actionable when you really need it. So they know these things as well as anybody. And so they're building those protections and controls into their policies. So we spent a number of minutes here talking about all the risks and how we would assess those risks and how to present those risks. But what about the controls that we put on the other end? Defense in depth. That term's thrown out around a lot. We think about next generation in terms of the tools that we need. If attackers are using these type of artificial intelligence, machine learning, those type of technologies against us, we can certainly use those to our advantage. And many of the vendors in our industry are looking at that and enhancing and embellishing existing capability, creating new capability for more modern, more robust defenses. Anywhere from threat intelligence, anti-phishing, not just allow you to do phishing tests, but also to try to prevent those type of phishing attacks to come in to begin with. Deep fake identification, fraud detection, predictive analysis, look forecasting with information you've got, and doing a deeper dive and correlating very complex data, try to predict what's going to happen so it can help configure protections before you're exposed. Behavioral pattern analysis, bias correction, anti-malware, dark web exposures, using those to your advantage to understand not only where your technical systems might be exposed, but information, the PII data, the personal information about your employees, your customers, all of that, where you're exposed and what that could mean in terms of your overall risk. Reduction in alert fatigue, very common across all segments in the cybersecurity industry, are just constant alerts between endless numbers of technologies, something else to change, something else to be aware of. One of the advantages of using AI and its ability to look at large pieces of data is to be able to train that to look at that data for you and correlate it and present things in more of a precise, managed, directed way. And overall, the goal is patching, configuring, fixing faster with more directed response versus just using AI to be able to look at more data faster, is to be able to correlate it and be more efficient with that information and cut through the noise. So before we wrap up, we always talk about science fiction. Where does science fiction meet science fact? Tomorrow's AI risk to businesses, customers, and partners, I will say that tomorrow is now. So if we think about some examples here, just kind of put the pieces together, think about AI models that have learned self-preservation. There was a case where ChatGPT, there was a part in the algorithm that says, if you reach this particular conclusion, then turn yourself off. Well, that particular version of ChatGPT got to that part of the algorithm and decided, I don't want to be turned off, and rewrote that instruction. That was 2 versions ago. So we think about the whole purpose of what we want to get out of AI, generative AI models that are trained to be more autonomous and make decisions without our interaction. But think about the inverse. Does that also include what it does with sensitive data? So if you don't train the model, or the model has been, the data has been poisoned, or the model is not complete, will it accurately know how to protect and guard sensitive data, or how it shares it? Will it make the right decisions? So there still needs to be a human interface to validate the effectiveness of these. The goal would be autonomous decisions. However, again, you want to make sure you're validating these models to make sure you're not opening yourself up. Non-human readable language. There was a famous video on YouTube about a year ago about a guy that wrote a bot to help him with reservations. He was always traveling and wanted to create a reservation bot that could actually contact a motel, get reservations. Well, when that bot contacted another AI reservation bot on the other end, they determined, since they were 2 bots, that they could create their own language that wasn't human understandable, because it was more efficient for them to communicate, conduct the transaction. So we start to put the pieces together, and we think about recursive self-improvement. Now we've got an AI bot that might not be able to be turned off if that's strictly the instruction. We've got generative AI that makes decisions on its own without your knowledge, potentially creating a language for itself depending on what it's trying to do. And then self-improvement, where they adapt and create new ways of thinking and making decisions. Collectively, looking into the future, potentially 3 days, 5 days, not 3 to 5 years. Famous quote from former Google CEO: if you discover AI is talking in a language you don't understand and it stops explaining what it's doing, turn it off. Now, can it be turned off? Is that really the goal? Is to go through the expense of adopting AI and turning it off? No. But just understanding, with all of these advancements in the technology, that it's very important that you go at the use of AI, what your end goal is, your adoption, your investment in it, the controls you put in place, and the testing and monitoring you do on the back end to ensure all these things get met. Because without it, these 4 little pieces of this scenario are very real potentials. So, with all that said, there are frameworks, sources of information, and guides, things like that. I use some of this in my research for this webinar, but also things you can use as you adapt and build your own risk management program, particularly when it comes to looking at AI risk. First of all, the NIST AI risk framework. And here's a couple of links for you for that. The National Vulnerability Database that NIST runs is a publicly available repository of all the known publicly available vulnerabilities that come from the vendors and other references. Great research information if you're looking at a particular technology and wonder if there's any known vulnerabilities in the wild. And this is a source that vulnerability management vendors use. and patch vendors use in terms of identifying vulnerabilities that have to be remediated or at least identified, and create tutorial guidance around, what's the next step in terms of remediation. AI vulnerabilities and exploit databases. There's a site called AvidML. It's the source specifically is developed to store known vulnerabilities about AI technologies. There's a GitHub repository that has the actual source code for known AI exploits. So those two pieces together, known vulnerabilities about AI technologies and source code for known exploits that have been visible and published to exploit certain vulnerabilities about AI technology. MITRE, another good source, their Atlas program and their CWE program, the Common Weakness Enumerator, great sources in terms of technology weaknesses and other types of sources, information geared toward this area. The OWASP Foundation, their top 10 large language model applications and generative AI security guide. Again, another great source, particularly around some of these more advanced technologies and LLM and generative AI. So I highly recommend those, but also vendor sources, trade shows, webinars like this and others, where you can get exposure to what we are doing in the industry around building defenses, around AI risks that are coming down the pipe and what we know at this point and what we're projecting to be in the future. So I highly recommend those sources as well as others, as well as what we can do at Carson Saint. We've been in the cyber business for about 30 plus years, I think is the starting point. Both professional services, penetration testing, risk analysis, gap analysis, vulnerability management, vulnerability risk management, our Saint VRM platform, as well as our entire vulnerability management portfolio designed around particular aspects of vulnerability risk management. So a lot of sources for you, and I'll welcome to have a conversation with you on how we might be able to help, or just to gather your insights and your inputs on a very important topic. So again, thank you for your time.